I never thought I'd be one of those women, the ones who post online about their crumbling marriage, desperately seeking clarity from strangers. But here I am, staring at my screen at 3 a.m., heart pounding, because I can't shake the feeling that something is seriously wrong. Michael and I have been married for 7 years. We weren't perfect, but I always thought we were solid. We built a life together, worked hard, made plans for the future. Or at least, I thought we did. Lately, though, something feels off. At first, it was little things. He started working late more often. His phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, now never leaves his pocket. He used to talk to me about his day, frustrations with his boss, the weird stuff his coworkers said. Now? Silence. The first time I noticed real proof something was up, I wasn't even trying to snoop. I walked past the home office and heard him on the phone, his voice low and urgent. I paused. Not to eavesdrop, just instinct, I guess. "It's almost done," he said. A pause. "Just a little longer. We'll start again soon." My stomach twisted. Start what again? I backed away before he could notice me, my mind racing. That night, I tested something. I casually asked if he wanted to plan a trip for our anniversary next year, something we'd talked about before, Italy, maybe, or a cabin in the mountains. He barely looked up from his plate. "Let's hold off on that," he said. "I've got a lot going on." That was the moment I knew. He wasn't planning on a future with me. I haven't confronted him yet. I need proof first. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. But I have this sinking feeling that whatever it is, it's worse than I think. If anyone has been through something like this, what did you do? How did you find out the truth? Because I don't think I'm ready for what I'm about to uncover. I didn't sleep after my last post. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to Michael's slow, even breathing. He slept like a man without a care in the world, like a man who wasn't whispering secrets into his phone, like a man who wasn't hiding something from his wife. I envied that kind of peace. The next morning, I decided I couldn't live in the unknown anymore. If something was happening, if he was planning something, I needed to be prepared. And if my gut feeling was wrong, if I was somehow misinterpreting things, then at least I'd have reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. Michael had been unusually persistent about organizing our finances over the past few weeks, casually bringing up joint accounts, passwords, and making sure everything is in one place. At the time, I thought maybe he was just being responsible, maybe he was thinking about long-term security. But now I had to wonder if he was setting something up, maneuvering things behind my back, preparing for a future that didn't include me. So I did something I never thought I'd have to do in my marriage. I checked our joint bank account. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Our paychecks deposited as usual, our bills deducted, our grocery store runs appearing like clockwork. But then I noticed something strange, a series of small withdrawals, always under $200, spaced out every few days. Not large enough to trigger suspicion, but frequent enough to add up over time. $180 at an ATM across town. $140 at a restaurant I'd never heard of. $175 transferred to an account I didn't recognize. I felt my hands go numb as I scrolled through the statements, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how we handled money. We always discussed major expenses, always planned things together. Michael wasn't the kind of person who just moved money around without telling me. Except, apparently, he was. Panic crept up my spine as a terrifying thought crossed my mind. Was he gambling? The idea made my stomach turn. Michael wasn't much of a risk-taker. He was the kind of man who double-checked locked doors, the kind who always calculated every possible outcome before making a decision. But maybe that was just what I thought I knew about him. Or maybe this wasn't about gambling at all. Maybe this was about something or someone else. I needed advice from someone who wouldn't just tell me I was being paranoid, someone who could help me protect myself if this turned into something worse. That's when I remembered Laura. Laura wasn't just a friend. She was one of the best divorce attorneys in the city. I hadn't spoken to her in a while, not since she moved firms, but we had stayed on good terms. I didn't want to believe I'd need her expertise, but right now, I needed guidance from someone who knew exactly how bad these things could get. I sent her a simple message. Hey, I need to ask you something about finances. Can we talk? She responded within minutes. Call me now. I stepped out onto the porch, away from Michael, away from any chance of being overheard. My fingers trembled as I dialed her number. Jess, she said the moment she picked up. Tell me everything. I laid it all out, every single thing, the secrecy, the strange phone calls, the sudden interest in merging accounts, and now, the unexplained money movements. I expected her to tell me I was overreacting, to say it was probably nothing. Instead, she sighed, the kind of sigh that only comes from seeing this scenario play out too many times before. This doesn't sound good, she said finally. It sounds like he's setting something up. Either he's moving assets before a divorce or he's trying to hide money for some other reason. My stomach dropped. I had been bracing myself for something bad, but hearing it from her made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. What do I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You protect yourself, she said, her tone firm. You move your money. You make sure that if he tries to blindside you, you have the upper hand. I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath. You think he's planning to leave me? There was a long pause before she answered. I think he's making moves that people usually make before they leave. The realization settled over me like a heavy fog. He wasn't just hiding something, he was preparing for something. And if he was preparing, that meant I needed to be one step ahead. After I ended the call with Laura, I wasted no time. I transferred all the money from our joint account into my personal savings, making sure to leave just enough to keep things looking normal. I moved my investments under a separate account with my mother's name attached. And the house, our home, I changed the title so that it was now in my mother's name, completely out of Michael's reach. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. I had just outmaneuvered my husband before he had the chance to do it to me. By the time he got home that evening, I had composed myself. I smiled at him when he walked through the door, asked him about his day like nothing had changed. He kissed my cheek, murmured something about work, and went straight to his office without another word. I watched him disappear down the hallway, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. He had no idea what I had done, no idea that I was no longer the clueless wife waiting to be played. Let him keep thinking I was in the dark. Because when he finally made his move, he'd realized too late, I was already ahead of him. Michael sat across from me at the kitchen table, his face carefully arranged into that pained, conflicted husband expression, like this was some unbearable weight he was finally setting down. He thought I would crumble, thought I would plead, thought I would grasp desperately for a marriage he had already thrown away behind my back. Instead, I folded my hands together, keeping my expression open, making sure he saw the hurt wife he was expecting, the one he had meticulously planned for in his little betrayal fantasy. If that's what you really need, I murmured, making sure my voice trembled just enough to be believable. If this is what will make you happy, I won't stand in your way. Michael let out a long, slow breath, as if I had relieved him of a heavy burden, as if I had just handed him exactly what he wanted without a fight. He had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but what he really wanted was submission. He wanted me to hand him the perfect exit while he walked away looking like the misunderstood victim. He had no idea what was coming. I knew you'd understand, he said, reaching across the table, as if he was offering some twisted form of comfort. I just think this is the best thing for both of us. I stared at his hand resting near mine, the same hand that had held mine on our wedding day, the same hand that had promised me forever. Now that hand belonged to someone else, or at the very least, it belonged to a man I no longer recognized. I resisted the urge to smile. He had no idea how much I had already taken from him. How do you see this working? I asked, keeping my voice small, like a woman scrambling to make sense of her husband's sudden abandonment. Are you talking about a trial separation, or something more final? Michael hesitated for a split second, barely noticeable, but I saw it, the flash of calculation in his eyes, the internal weighing of options. He had already made his decision, but now he had to control how I reacted to it. "I think we should move toward divorce," he finally said, his voice low, like he was delivering tragic news instead of a well-rehearsed script. I don't want to keep pretending. I care about you, but I'm not the same person anymore." He was good. I would give him that. But I had already read the entire script before he ever opened his mouth. I dropped my gaze to my lap, taking slow, deliberate breaths, as if I was struggling to process the shock of it all. He needed to believe I was behind him in this game, that I was only now catching up to the reality he had been constructing for months. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael's body relaxed even more, his shoulders dropping slightly, his confidence rising, as if he had just cleared the hardest hurdle. He thought I was accepting it. He thought I was backing down. "Yeah," he admitted, leaning back in his chair, his active guilt giving way to something closer to relief. "I didn't want to bring it up too soon, but I've already started the process." "Of course you have." He thought he was playing a clean game, making all the right moves, lining up the perfect divorce that would leave him exactly where he wanted, financially secure, morally unscathed, and free to pursue whatever life he had been planning behind my back. He had no idea that every single one of his chess pieces had already been knocked off the board. I took a shaky breath and looked up at him, making sure my eyes glistened just enough to sell it. "So, what happens next?" I asked, watching him closely, watching the moment he realized I wasn't fighting. Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp white envelope, setting it on the table between us like a goddamn peace offering. "I already spoke with my lawyer about keeping this as amicable as possible," he said, sliding the envelope toward me. "I want to make sure we both come out of this okay." I hesitated before reaching for it, my fingers grazing the edge of the envelope, my stomach twisting, not from fear, but from the sheer anticipation of what was about to happen next. I flipped it open, pulling out the neatly typed document, my eyes skimming over the words he probably thought I wouldn't understand. "Spousal support. 50% of all assets. The house. The joint accounts." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Michael was sitting there, smiling gently, believing he had successfully cornered me into agreeing to terms he thought would leave him comfortable while I quietly faded into the background of his new life. He had no idea. I carefully set the papers down, exhaling through my nose, making sure my hands trembled just slightly, as if I was overwhelmed, as if I hadn't spent the past 2 weeks obliterating every single one of his options. "Michael," I whispered, letting my voice crack just enough to make him lean in. His brows furrowed, concern flashing across his face, the well-trained good husband act still flickering behind his eyes. "What is it?" he asked. I reached under the table and pulled out my own envelope, just as crisp, just as neat, just as devastating as the one he had just given me. He frowned, confused, his fingers closing around the paper, his brain already struggling to reconcile the fact that I had something he hadn't anticipated. "What's this?" he asked, flipping it open, scanning the first page. I watched his face as realization set in. The assets? No longer in my name. The investments? Transferred weeks ago. The house? Never legally his to begin with. Michael's hands tightened around the paper, his breathing shifting, his face paling as he realized what he was looking at. I smiled. "That," I said, tilting my head slightly, "is what happens when you try to play a game with someone smarter than you." His mouth opened, but no words came out. I reached across the table, picked up his envelope, and gently slid it back toward him. "You can keep this," I said, standing up, letting my full height loom over him as he sat frozen in place. "Looks like you're the one walking away with nothing." Michael finally looked up at me, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and rising panic. "Jessica," he breathed, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like fear. I smiled again, softer this time, almost pitying him. "Enjoy your new apartment, Michael," I said as I walked toward the door, my heart pounding with triumph. I hear it's lovely this time of year. Michael had officially moved out. He packed his bags with an air of quiet victory, never once suspecting that he was walking away with absolutely nothing. I had watched him load the last of his things into his car, the smugness in his expression unmistakable, as if he was finally stepping into the life he believed he deserved. I stood on the front porch, arms crossed, pretending to be devastated, pretending I wasn't already miles ahead of him in this game. Once he drove away, I went inside and locked the door, exhaling the breath I had been holding for days. The house was mine. The money was mine. The future was mine. But something still nagged at me, something that had been crawling under my skin since the moment he announced he wanted a divorce. This wasn't just about finding himself or needing space. There was something else, something bigger, something he thought I would never uncover. And so, I did what any woman with a strong Wi-Fi connection and a hell of a lot of motivation would do. I started digging. Michael had never been particularly careful with his social media presence, always convinced that I wasn't paying attention, always assuming I wasn't smart enough to connect the dots. But I was paying attention, and I had every intention of finding out exactly what he had been hiding. I scrolled through his old posts, noting the subtle shifts in his activity over the past few months. He had started liking different kinds of photos, trendy rooftop bars, sleek hotel lobbies, expensive vacations in places we had never talked about visiting together. And then I saw it. A name that kept appearing over and over again in the comment sections. Sophia Carter. I clicked on her profile, my heart beat steady, my breathing calm, already knowing exactly what I was about to find. Her account was private, but her profile picture told me everything I needed to know. A woman in her mid-20s, blonde, petite, the kind of person who carefully curates her image to appear effortlessly perfect. And there, in the reflection of her oversized sunglasses, was something I recognized all too well. Michael's Lexus, parked right behind her. My husband, who had spent the last several months telling me he needed space, who had looked me in the eye and insisted that this divorce was about personal growth, had been spending time with her. And I was willing to bet this hadn't started after he told me he wanted to leave. I needed more than just social media breadcrumbs. I needed hard proof, something undeniable, something that would leave no room for misinterpretation. So, I did what any rational woman in my position would do. I called Amanda Johnson. Amanda and I weren't particularly close, but we had mutual friends, and more importantly, she had always been the kind of person who knew things. If something was happening in our social circle, Amanda had already heard about it and was 3 steps ahead of the gossip train. The phone barely rang before she picked up, her voice light and curious, like she had been expecting my call. Jessica. Wow, it's been a while. How are things? I wasted no time with pleasantries. Amanda, do you know anything about Michael and a girl named Sophia Carter? The silence on the other end stretched for just a second too long, and that told me everything I needed to know. Amanda cleared her throat, her voice dropping slightly. Look, I don't want to get involved in anything messy, but are you sure you want to know? I let out a soft laugh, one that carried the weight of knowing too much already. Amanda, I already do know. I just need you to confirm it. She exhaled, and then, just like that, the dam broke. Michael's been seeing her for months, Jess. I don't know all the details, but I do know that people have spotted them together a lot. Restaurants, bars, weekend trips, he wasn't even trying to be discreet. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, feeling a strange mix of fury and vindication settle deep in my bones. He had been cheating. He had orchestrated this entire divorce, convinced he would walk away with half of everything, while his little girlfriend waited for him on the other side. Amanda hesitated before adding one last detail, the final nail in Michael's coffin. Jessica. I don't know if you've seen them together in person yet, but if you want real proof, you might want to check out that Italian place on Maple. They go there all the time. I didn't hesitate. That evening, I drove to the restaurant, parking just far enough away that I wouldn't be noticed. I stepped inside, keeping to the shadows, scanning the tables, waiting for the moment I could see it with my own eyes. And then, there they were. Michael, sitting across from her, leaning in just a little too close, laughing like a man who had no idea that his entire life was about to come crashing down around him. Sophia, smiling at him like she had just won the lottery, like she wasn't sitting across from a man who had lost everything without even realizing it yet. I could have confronted them right then and there, could have caused a scene, could have shattered whatever fantasy Michael had built around his shiny new life. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a picture, one clear shot that captured them in all their oblivious glory. Because this was only the beginning. Michael walked into the mediation meeting like a man who still believed he had won, like someone who had no idea the entire game had already been decided without him. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive dress shirt, the one he probably bought to impress her, and sat across from me with the casual confidence of a man expecting to walk away with a financial victory. He had no idea that the life he thought he was securing for himself had already slipped through his fingers. His lawyer, a man named Richard Calloway, was exactly the kind of attorney Michael would have chosen, smug, expensive, and completely unaware that they were both walking into a massacre. He leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him like we were all just reasonable adults having a civilized conversation. "Jessica," Richard began, offering me a smile that was clearly meant to be disarming. "Michael wants to ensure that this process is as smooth and amicable as possible. He values your history together, and he hopes you can come to a fair and equitable resolution." I resisted the urge to laugh. Michael wasn't here for fairness. He was here to walk away with the house, a chunk of my savings, and a monthly alimony check large enough to keep him and Sophia living comfortably. He had spent the last few months engineering this divorce, believing he would end up financially secure, while I quietly unraveled every thread of his carefully laid plans. I glanced at my own lawyer, Carolyn Reese, a woman who had spent the last decade annihilating men like Michael in courtrooms all over the state. She gave me a small nod, her expression unreadable, and then calmly slid a stack of documents across the table. "I appreciate that, Richard," she said, her voice smooth and professional. "But before we discuss equitable resolutions, I think it's important that Michael takes a look at these." Michael frowned slightly, but picked up the papers, flipping through them with the same disinterest he probably used when reviewing expense reports at work. I watched his expression shift, the first flicker of confusion crossing his face as he skimmed the contents. His grip on the pages tightened. The confidence in his posture disappeared. "What is this?" he finally asked, his voice just a little too tight, just a little too forced. Carolyn adjusted her glasses, exuding the kind of composed authority that made weaker men break into a sweat. "That is documentation showing that all of Jessica's assets, including her savings, investments, and the house, were transferred into her mother's name over a month ago." Richard blinked, clearly thrown off his well-rehearsed script, his mouth opening slightly before he quickly masked his shock. Michael, however, was still staring at the papers, his mind scrambling, his carefully constructed future crumbling in real time. He turned to me, his expression one of pure disbelief. "You transferred everything?" I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression carefully neutral, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for him to feel it. "Yes," I said simply, watching as the full weight of my words settled over him. Michael's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the papers so tightly that I half expected them to tear. He had walked into this meeting thinking he was about to take something from me. He hadn't even considered the possibility that there was nothing left for him to take. "This is fraud," he hissed, his voice lower now, his anger barely contained. "You can't just hide assets to avoid splitting them in a divorce." Carolyn let out a small, almost sympathetic sigh, tilting her head slightly as if she truly pitied his lack of preparation. "Actually, Michael," she said smoothly, "Jessica was well within her legal rights to transfer her assets before formal divorce proceedings began. There was nothing fraudulent about it." Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to salvage what was left of his client's position, already seeing the storm clouds rolling in. "We can contest this," Richard said, though his voice lacked the confidence he had started with. "A judge may see this as an intentional attempt to prevent a fair division of property." Carolyn smiled, the kind of smile that made it clear she had already anticipated this response. "You're welcome to try, of course," she said, sliding another document across the table. "But given that Michael has been engaging in an extramarital affair and was likely attempting to secure financial assets for his new relationship, I doubt a judge will have much sympathy for him." Michael's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid, the carefully crafted facade of calm rationality shattering completely. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "That," Carolyn said, her tone unwavering, "is photographic evidence of you and Miss Sophia Carter at various restaurants, hotels, and social gatherings over the past 6 months. Gathered legally, of course." Michael's face turned an alarming shade of red. I could practically hear the gears in his head turning, the desperate scramble to find a way out, a way to undo everything he had walked into. But there was no way out. There was no undoing this. I had played the long game, and I had won. Richard exhaled slowly, his professional demeanor slipping slightly as he turned to Michael. "I think we need to reconsider our approach here." Michael slammed his hands down on the table, his fury barely contained, his desperation finally boiling over. "You think you're so smart," he spat, glaring at me as if I was the reason his life was now in ruins. "You think you can just screw me over and walk away like you're some kind of genius?" I tilted my head slightly, watching him, letting his anger wash over me like water over stone. "I don't think I'm smart, Michael," I said, my voice calm, measured, unwavering. "I know I am." Silence filled the room. Michael's hands curled into fists, his breathing ragged, his entire body radiating the energy of a man who had just realized he was officially, irreversibly screwed. Carolyn gathered the documents neatly, stacking them with precision, before giving Richard a small, knowing nod. "I think we're done here," she said, standing gracefully, already prepared to leave. "Unless, of course, Michael would like to discuss spousal support he may owe Jessica instead?" Michael shot up from his chair, knocking it backward, his fury rolling off him in waves. He had nothing left. No power, no leverage, no money. And Sophia? She wouldn't be sticking around once she realized that Michael had just lost everything. I stood, adjusting my coat, giving Michael one final look, letting him see the victory in my eyes before I turned toward the door. "You should have been more careful, Michael," I murmured, not bothering to look back. "Because when you play stupid games, you win exactly what you deserve." Michael stormed out of the mediation meeting, his face a mask of barely contained rage, his carefully constructed future reduced to nothing but dust. His confident stride had turned into something almost frantic, his mind no doubt racing with the realization that every move he had made in this divorce had been countered before he even knew what was happening. I watched him leave, my expression unreadable, my heartbeat steady, my sense of victory tempered only by the knowledge that this wasn't over yet. Michael wasn't the kind of man who handled consequences well. He had always been the type to assume he was untouchable, to believe that no matter what happened, he would always come out on top. But now, for the first time in his life, he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down, realizing there was no safety net beneath him. And I wasn't about to throw him a rope. By the time I got home, my phone had already started buzzing with messages from mutual friends, people who had just heard what had gone down. Word spread fast, especially when a man like Michael, so smug, so arrogant, so convinced of his own invincibility, was publicly humiliated. Amanda, the same friend who had confirmed Michael's affair, sent me a simple message. "Oh my God. Everyone is talking about this. He must be losing his mind." I leaned against the kitchen counter, rereading the text, allowing myself the smallest, most satisfied smile. Michael had spent months setting up his perfect exit plan, believing that he could manipulate me into passively handing over everything we built. He had envisioned a future where he walked away financially secure, with a younger woman on his arm, while I quietly disappeared into the background. Instead, he had walked away with nothing but a lease on a tiny apartment, a dwindling bank account, and a mistress who had yet to realize her dream life was no longer possible. I had taken everything that mattered to him before he even knew to fight for it. And the best part? I wasn't the only one who wanted revenge. I had barely settled onto my couch when my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Sarah Mitchell, an old friend of ours who had recently become an accidental witness to Michael's downfall. "You will not believe what I just saw. Meet me for coffee. I have tea." Curious, I agreed, driving to our usual cafe, already suspecting what this was about. Sarah was waiting for me when I arrived, her eyes practically shining with excitement, her hands gripping her latte like she was physically restraining herself from speaking too loudly. I sat across from her, raising an eyebrow, waiting for her to spill whatever news had her looking like Christmas came early. "Jessica," she whispered, leaning in, "Michael and Sophia had a massive fight outside her apartment today." And when I say massive, I mean neighbors came outside to watch. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard, though I should have seen this coming. Sophia had never been in this for love. She had been in it for what she thought Michael could give her: a comfortable lifestyle, financial security, a man who could take care of her. But now? Now Michael was just another broke, divorced man with nothing to offer. "What happened?" I asked, sipping my coffee, already knowing this was going to be good. Sarah smirked, lowering her voice conspiratorially. She was screaming at him about money. Apparently, he told her they'd be fine, but she just found out about the asset transfers. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Of course she had just found out. Michael, in all his arrogance, had probably promised her the world, convinced that he would walk out of our marriage financially secure. He had expected to have access to my savings, my investments, my house. Instead, he had nothing. Sarah grinned, clearly enjoying every second of this. She kept yelling, "You told me we'd be fine. You lied to me." I set down my coffee, shaking my head, picturing the scene in my mind. Michael standing there, dumbfounded, realizing that the young, adoring girlfriend he had left me for was now turning on him, just like he had turned on me. He told her he just needed time, Sarah continued, rolling her eyes. And she told him she's not going back to living paycheck to paycheck for some loser who can't even afford dinner. Oh, that was beautiful. Sophia had probably spent the past few months fantasizing about luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and stability. She had assumed that Michael was her golden ticket, a man who had already built something, someone she could just step into a life with. She had no idea she had bet on the wrong man. The next day, Michael called me. I almost didn't pick up, almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. "Jessica," he said, his voice tight, controlled, desperate beneath the surface. "We need to talk." I leaned back against my couch, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it before I finally responded. "About what, Michael?" I asked, keeping my voice light, unbothered, as if he was nothing more than a distant memory. He exhaled sharply, frustrated, as if I was the one making this difficult. "You didn't have to do this," he muttered, his voice laced with anger. "You didn't have to." "Didn't have to what, Michael?" I interrupted, my tone sharpening. "Didn't have to protect myself? Didn't have to make sure you couldn't steal from me? Didn't have to ensure you couldn't fund your new life on my back?" Silence. A long, painful silence. "You ruined me," he finally said, his voice low, furious, pathetic. I smiled. "No, Michael," I murmured, my voice calm, unwavering. "You ruined yourself." I hung up. A month later, Michael had officially disappeared from our social circles, his reputation in tatters, his future nothing more than an uncertain mess of bad decisions. Sophia? She had left him within a week, moving on to a new man, someone with actual resources. His family, once eager to defend him, had turned their backs the moment they realized the truth, that he had betrayed me, that he had lied to everyone, that he had orchestrated this divorce believing he would win. Instead, he was left with nothing. And me? I had my house. I had my money. I had my peace. And I had the absolute certainty that Michael would never, ever recover from the lesson I had just taught him.